Searching for silver. What gold had been to California, silver was now to Nevada, and Sam Clemens was itching to try his luck prospecting. It would have been a strange young man, indeed, who was not excited by the stories of the enormous fortunes that were being made on every side. The word Humboldt was on everyone's lips. People were saying that the Humboldt strike would prove greater than the famous Comstock lode. The rich silver vein, which had been discovered near Virginia City in 1857 and which had started thousands of miners on a new migration. A little over 6 weeks after Orion and Sam arrived, there was another big strike, and Sam saw this as the opportunity to make his fortune. Rumor said that for every 100 pounds of ore that came from the Humboldt mountain, there was 2 or 3 times as much silver as in Comstock ore. Sam and two friends, Billy Claggett and A.W. Oliver, both young lawyers, decided to go prospecting together. They selected as a guide a young blacksmith, Balau, who actually had some experience mining and who also recommended himself as a cook. The four started off with the usual equipment for mining, a couple of horses and a wagon loaded down with tools, pickaxes, supplies and snake medicine. On this trip, there was also a cribbage board and a book of hymns. Orion kept the unabridged dictionary in Carson City. The trip to Humboldt region was difficult in the extreme. There was no marked road to follow, and the horses had a hard time making their way with the heavy load. Often the party bogged down in sand and the four men had to get out and push and heave until they managed to free the horses and cart. The amount of provisions, the rough terrain, and the problems with the horses soon wore them out. The horses dragged the wagon 2 miles from town and then gave out. Sam Clemens reminisced in Innocence Abroad, recalling that terrible time, pushing through sand that had no bottom, toiling all day long by the wrecks of 1,000 wagons, the skeletons of 10,000 oxen by wagon tires, enough to hoop the Washington Monument to the top, and ox chains enough to girdle Long Island by human graves, with our throats parched always with thirst, lips bleeding from the alkali dust, hungry, perspiring, and very, very weary, so weary that when we dropped in the sand every 50 yards to rest the horses, we could hardly keep from going to sleep. To add to their difficulties, they ran into trouble with Indians. For a moment, Sam thought he had seen his last day on earth, but the Indian turned out to be more interested in presents than scalps. The party was allowed to continue after giving the Indians some gifts. The party went on, buoyed by the hope of making their fortune. What they asked themselves was a little hardship in the face of lifetime of wealth, but when they at last reached the mining settlement, they saw that conditions there were possibly even worse than those they had experienced on the trail. It had taken 15 days to make the trip of 200 miles, 13 really, for they had stopped once for a couple of days to allow the horses to regain their strength. The four arrived in Unionville, Humboldt County, through a blinding snowstorm. If Carson City had been something of disappointment to some, Unionville was more so. The whole town consisted of 11 cabins and the ever present Liberty Pole. The men got to work constructing the typical Humboldt house. They dug a square in the steep side of the mountain and then set up two uprights, which they topped with two joists. Over this, they stretched a sheet of homemade cotton cloth, forming a roof. The sides and back were dirt walls, which the digging had provided. They made a chimney simply by turning back a flap of the corner of the roof. Balau was the most experienced miner of the four, which wasn't saying much, and he was elected to direct operations. Some had the notion that they could wander around the mountain sides, picking up nuggets as big as their fists, and that their fortunes would be made in a matter of days. He turned out to be mistaken. Balau set the group to digging in the snow-covered mountainside, a back-breaking chore. The four men pitched in and worked as hard as they could, but they did not discover any silver. One day Balau reported he thought he had found a good place. The four began digging and they made excavations in the rock. They planned to blast with dynamite, but Balau decided that to find anything worthwhile they needed to sink a shaft. They simply had not the tools for such an extensive operation, although they sent a claim to the mining office, hoping to sell their find. No one seemed interested. One disappointment followed another, and their resources were running low. Some began to think the mining business made more paupers than princes. Orion and Sam had bought feet in various of the Esmeralda mines, and Sam thought that he might do well to go over there to check how their investments were making out. He set out with Balau and a Prussian Ollendorf, but the two lawyers said that they had had enough mining. They would stay in Humboldt and practice law. The miners were always having squabbles, and the two men thought they might make their fortunes out of quarrels instead of silver. Balaus, Sam, and Ollendorff started off with high hopes. It seemed to Sam that leaving Humboldt was one of the wisest decisions he had ever made, but he had not gone very far where he wondered if bad luck were not stalking him. A few hours after their departure, the three men found themselves in the midst of a bad snowstorm. They were determined to go on, but the storm grew worse and worse. The three agreed that they had to keep moving or they would freeze. The horses stumbled and refused to get up. Balaus swore at them and pulled and tugged, but each time they went down, he had a harder time rousing them. The second day was worse than the first. On the third day, all hope deserted. Under deserted young Clemens, finally they came to a little inn. The inn was filled with the worst kind of men, and it was apparent that even the slightest quarrel could lead to a deadly fight. Sam and Balau ate some greasy rabbit stew and then went for a stroll to get out of the tense atmosphere. Nearby, an Indian village was in the midst of hastily packing up and making off. Teepees were being dismantled. Dogs were running about and squaws were picking up pemmican and loading blankets on the horses. Everything was noise and confusion. It was obvious that the Indians were terrified of some evil, but Sam and Balau were at a loss to make out what it was. Sam, who was the braver of the two, tried to inquire what was the matter, but he could not get anyone to stop and explain. Finally, a young brave took time out to point to the creek. Much water, he said soon. Balau and Sam thought the Indian was crazy. The creek was gentle and placid. There was nothing to be afraid of. It was no doubt the work of some medicine man who had hidden reason for wanting the tribe to move on. Let's get some sleep, Sam proposed. I am dead. The two men were hardly more than into their dreams back at the inn when there was a tremendous outcry. Horses were stamping in their stalls. The livestock was in a panic, and men were running, shouting, and cursing on all sides of them. Balau, who thought that a gun battle had broken out, rushed to see what had happened. The Carson River had run rampant. There was water on all sides of them. By the time Sam and his friend got downstairs to see what their horses, they were sloshing along in water that lapped over their boots. In a few moments, the men and animals were on higher ground. The inn was a little island in the middle of all those rushing waters. The flood lasted a week, and Sam and his friends were marooned at Honey Lake Smith's, as the inn was known. The whole 7 days were a procession of swearing, drinking, card playing, and fighting, punctuated by dirt and vermin. By the eighth day, the stream had gone down, but it was still too swollen for a safe crossing. Nevertheless, Ollendorf, Balau, and Sam elected to attempt a crossing. They were thoroughly fed up with the life at the inn. They took off a canoe, the horses attached to the stern. The horses lost their footing, and Ollendorf panicked, fearing that the boat would upset and that the three men would be swept to death in the strong current. We warned Ollendorf to keep his wits about him and handle himself carefully, writes Sam in Roughing It. But it was useless. The moment the boat touched the bank, he made a spring and the canoe whirled upside down in 10-foot water. Ollendorf seized some brush and dragged himself ashore, but Balau and I had to swim for it, encumbered with our overcoats. But we held on to the canoe, and although we were washed down nearly to Carson, we managed to push the boat ashore and make a safe landing. The horses were saved too, but the two men were soaked through, and it was no time of the year for such a drenching. They had to bail out the canoe and let horses, men, and blankets dry out overnight before going on. The next morning, they left for Carson City regardless of the fact that furious snow storm was blowing. Balau was dubious about the direction the three should take, but Ollendorf said his instinct was as sensitive as any compass and that he could strike a beeline for Carson City and never diverge from it. The trio started out in an unmarked white world, heads bent against the snow. After a while, they sighted hoof prints and were encouraged. As they continued, the number of prints grew and grew. We wondered, Sam says, how so large a party came to be traveling at such a time and in such solitude. Somebody suggested that it must be a company of soldiers from the fort, and so we accepted that solution and jogged along a little faster still. Still, they seemed to be making no progress, but the prints in the snow increased as if the platoon of soldiers had expanded into regiment. Finally, Balau reined in his horse and looked down at the prints. Boys, he said, these are our own tracks, and we have actually been circusing around and round in a circle for more than 2 hours out there here in this blind desert. After all their cold, hard travel, they were still in sight of the inn. The three men stood in the snow, hesitating. They did not want to spend another night at Honey Lake Smith's, but they could not trust Ollendorf's compass either. While they were debating, the stagecoach forded the river, and the three men fell in line behind it. Although the fresh horses of the stage soon pulled it far ahead, the three men told themselves they could follow the tracks in the snow. They continued for some time, then Sam noticed that the tracks were getting fainter and fainter. At last they ceased altogether. The snow had covered them. Darkness fell and they were afraid to continue. The only thing to do was to make camp, to try to get a fire going and wait until morning. In their haste to leave Honey Lake Smith's, they had gone off half prepared, and now they discovered that they had only 4 matches. Balau having those, Sam and Ollendorf having none. The three gathered sagebrush and hopefully struck one match after another, trying to ignite the wet wood. When they had used up 3, they began to panic, and in the ensuing confusion, Sam let go of the reins of the horses, and the horses bolted. The last match failed. They were now lost in the snow. It was dark and cold, and their horses had run off. They had no provisions, no blankets, no way of keeping warm. They knew that it was fatal to fall asleep, but they could not keep their eyes open. Sam tried continually to rouse his 2 friends, but they gradually sank down in sleep. He went about brushing snow off them, trying to make them wake up, but they slept blanketed with snow. Then Sam felt himself slipping down into sleep. He could not stop his eyelids from closing, and as he dozed off, he remembered stories of other men who had given in to the temptation to lay down in the warm snow and sleep, and who had frozen to death. He awoke to hear Balau shouting savagely. They had fallen into the snow only a few yards from a stagecoach station. Their horses were standing by the shade. They had nearly died in what they thought was a wilderness when they needed only to have walked 5 minutes for food, shelter, and warmth.